President Trump is extending the ceasefire with Iran, citing what he calls Tehran's seriously fractured leadership. Peace talks are still up in the air after Vice President J.D. Vance's trip to Pakistan was put on hold. On social media, Mr. Trump said Pakistan asked the U.S. to extend the truce until Iran could, quote, come up with a unified proposal. But in an interview hours earlier, he was adamant he would not move the deadline. Now, it's not clear whether Iran or Israel will abide by the extended ceasefire. Overnight, at least 2 ships came under attack in the Strait of Hormuz. Iranian state media claims Tehran seized the vessels. President Trump says the U.S. will continue its blockade on Iranian ports, which Tehran has already called an act of war. We've got team coverage on all of this for you this morning. Aaron Navarro is tracking the latest on the ceasefire from our D.C. bureau. But let's begin with CBS News senior foreign correspondent Imtiaz Tyab, continuing his coverage in Islamabad. Good morning, Imtiaz. What more can you tell us about these reports of attacks in the Strait of Hormuz on container ships there?
Errol, we've got a very serious situation developing in the Strait of Hormuz. We understand at least 2 vessels, possibly a third, have essentially been impounded, taken by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, and are being sailed currently into Iranian waters. Now, these, what we understand, are cargo vessels. Now, this, of course, follows U.S. forces seizing an Iranian-linked vessel as it tried to pass through the strait into the Indian Ocean, where the U.S. has its own blockade at the very end of the Strait of Hormuz, also opening fire on that vessel. And all just underscores the real tension between both the U.S. and Iran ahead of these talks, which were supposed to be held here in Islamabad. But we still haven't seen those talks materialize, with the president saying that there is a ceasefire in place, but not saying how long that ceasefire is going to be. And very quickly, Errol, I should just add, we were in the Strait of Hormuz just a few days ago. We could see vessel after vessel, tanker after tanker just sitting there. And it really just betrayed this calm that we were there. And now we're seeing these tensions really ramp up at a time when both sides should be talking. Errol.
And publicly, Imtiaz, what has the reaction been from Iran to President Trump's decision to extend the ceasefire indefinitely?
So we've seen a few statements. Iran's social media tends to be very pointed in the way that it sort of addresses some of the issues, kind of echoing some of the points that we've seen President Trump post on his social media, of course, presenting their most maximalist position. The reality is, though, is that when President Trump announced the ceasefire, which he did not define how long it would be, that extension, rather, the reality is that he is correct when he says that the Iranian leadership is fractured. It is. We have to remember the supreme leader, who had been the supreme leader for over 3 decades, was killed on the first day of the U.S. and Israel-led war on Iran. And now we have a new supreme leader who we've not seen. And so there is a lot of uncertainty around who is actually leading these talks and whether or not they've been empowered to make any decisions. But here in Pakistan, we know the Pakistani leadership is working incredibly hard to keep these talks together. They want to see both sides negotiating at a table here in the capital, Islamabad. But again, we have the vice president still in Washington. We have the Iranian delegation still in Tehran. So those talks still seem a way off. Errol.
Quite a tense moment. Imtiaz, thank you. CBS News White House reporter Aaron Navarro joins us now from our D.C. bureau to speak about the U.S. side of the equation. Good morning, Aaron. So this time yesterday, President Trump was making it seem as if the U.S. was ready to carry on a military campaign. So why the change of heart from him regarding a ceasefire?
It was definitely a change after spending days saying he leaned towards not extending the ceasefire. And as you mentioned, and as Imtiaz talked about, the president cited those fractures between Iran's leadership. Specifically, we've seen that between their foreign ministry and the country's military, the Revolutionary Guard, which has been increasing their control of the country. The president yesterday also cited a request from mediators in Pakistan who have hosted talks between the U.S. and Iran to hold the U.S. attacks President Trump talked about on Iran's bridges and power plants until the country presents a unified proposal. Democrats on Capitol here in the U.S. have been critical of the president's approach. Take a listen to Congressman Adam Smith, the ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee.
Everyone seems to think that Trump has some sort of mad genius to what he's doing. seems to me like he's just an arrogant egotist popping off in ways that aren't well thought out and don't advance any sort of strategic plan.
Now, in another post yesterday that maybe gave some signals to why he agreed to extend that ceasefire, the president seemed to argue that it was the U.S. who now has leverage with the Strait of Hormuz due to their blockade of Iranian ships at ports. He wrote that Iran had approached him 4 days ago to reopen it, but that he refused. And he wrote, quote, "If we do that, there can never be a deal with Iran unless we blow up the rest of their country, their leaders included."
And Aaron, just to give our viewers some insight into how last-minute decision-making was from the White House, what is the status of potential peace talks? Because Vice President J.D. Vance and his team were apparently ready to go yesterday, and that was canceled at the very last minute.
Air Force Two was waiting at Joint Base Andrews, ready to leave for Pakistan, but the vice president did not leave for Pakistan, as previously expected. There was confusion at the White House on why the vice president was still waiting, and then eventually why he was heading towards the White House and not Pakistan. Our understanding is those talks have been postponed indefinitely. And throughout the day yesterday, as well as Monday, as the White House waited to send the vice president, it had been an open question on how committed Iran was to these talks and whether they would send anyone to Islamabad. Iran has blamed the U.S. for this impasse, saying it had continued to violate the ceasefire agreement through its naval blockade in the Strait.
All right, Aaron Navarro in our D.C. bureau with the latest. Aaron, thanks. One of the central questions from these negotiations is what to do with Iran's nuclear program. President Trump said last week Iran agreed to work with the U.S. on removing Iranian-enriched uranium. He calls it nuclear dust. But a spokesperson for Iran quickly pushed back on those claims. Then, on Monday, the president posted that Iran's nuclear sites were destroyed by strikes in last June's Operation Midnight Hammer, and that digging them out would be a long and difficult process. So what's really going on here? We're joined now by Joel Rayburn. He's a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute's Center for Peace and Security in the Middle East. Joel, good morning. Is there currently an accurate assessment of the state of Iran's nuclear program? The president said it was obliterated last summer. What do the facts tell us?
Yeah, I think, well, there are a lot of unknowns, but the president's right. The bulk of what the Iranians were working on, which is the highly enriched uranium, is buried under rubble. The largest portion of it that I think we know of is buried under rubble under Isfahan. Very, very difficult to retrieve. It's in gas canister form, so it would have to be enriched further. But since it's in gas form, it can be fed into centrifuges again. Then it would have to be turned into metal if the Iranians were to try to use it in a weapon. Very difficult to get to, buried under the mountain like that. But so it would take quite a long time, and I think it would be detected because every intelligence and surveillance system I think we have and the Israelis have in the world at our access that we can access is trained on that site.
How then was it true that Iran was close to having a nuclear weapon, which was the kind of reason we were told for getting into this war?
Well, when you've enriched uranium to that 60% grade, you are just a very short distance away from enriching it to weapons grade. And then you put it into the engineering process to turn it into metal and put it into a weapon. And we know from the captured documents of their nuclear weapons program that they had already come up with a design for being able to put it in a weapon. Then the other element is putting it on a ballistic missile that can carry that kind of warhead. And we know they have those kind of ballistic missiles. So the fissile material at weapons grade was sort of the last element.
And if a deal is not agreed to, a military operation to retrieve the uranium could also in and of itself be challenging. Retired Vice Admiral Robert Howard spoke about that on 60 Minutes Sunday. Listen to this.
It's high risk. You have to occupy territory. You have to confront. You have to force your way in. So all those risks are inherent in that operation, but we can do it.
So what would an operation like that, how would that unfold?
Yeah, it would be very difficult. I mean, Isfahan, the main site, is deep in Iran's interior, so you would have to do something on a massive scale that would look like the rescue of the pilots, where you would mount an incursion and you'd have to do that under hostile fire. It'd be very difficult, not impossible, as Vice Admiral said, but very difficult. Which I mean, look, the Iranian regime has created a dilemma for itself. that it is actually probably easier to destroy the regime than to mount that kind of operation. The regime is very vulnerable. This is actually, if you're judging whether to try to mount that kind of incursion or to take out the regime's critical infrastructure, their telecoms, their electricity, and so on, their refining capacity, which could probably result in the collapse of the regime in fairly short order. That is the situation that the Iranian regime has presented. That's the escalatory option that I think President Trump has.
Or a very complicated situation indeed. Joel Rayburn, thanks for breaking it down for us.
My pleasure.